The story of Samson is so poignant because Samson grows up in a place of privilege and of power. Samson was an extraordinary man, the Bible says, of physical strength. I mean, this guy had a six-pack upon a six-pack. He was a bad dude. And if you read the story, this hero becomes complacent with his privilege in Jesus Christ or in God. And he has this position as a judge. He's a position of influence in his community, a position where no doubt he was very well respected. It doesn't say anything about this, but I mean, when I hear golden locks, not golden, probably dark hair, but I got no hair, so I'm just kind of envious. This guy had to be a handsome dude. I mean, he probably had long, flowing hair. He was big, he was strong, he was charismatic. I mean, he was the talk of the town. And I can deduce from the story, we all know it, some of you probably have read it more recently, that he began to feel like this is who he was, that it wasn't a gift of God's blessings and provision, but he was like, you know what? Yeah, they're right. I am something. I am somebody who's powerful. I am somebody who is influential. I deserve to be put on the pedestal. And the story tells us that he got complacent and comfortable. He ignored the call that God was giving him to deliver him from the enemies, the Philistines at the time, and he brushed off his parental concerns and directly disobeys his vow to God. We all know the story from Sunday school or reading it yourself. He gets in when giving into anger and lust and hooks up with the wrong people, and next thing you know, he's chopping off his vow with God, his hair. And we all know, too familiar, that his enemies end up capturing him, and he ends up in the greatest point of weakness and vulnerability. Now, that's the story we all learned in Sunday school, but what hit me is that this guy went from the highest high to the lowest lows. He's grinding at the mill. He's being treated basically like a donkey, because that was the job of a beast of burden, to grind at the mill. And this guy's sitting there probably alongside some livestock grinding at the mill. He's really at the lowest point of his life. But in his lowest point of weakness, Judges chapter 16, verses 28 and 30 records this. It says, in his moment of utter defeat, blinded, imprisoned, and reduced to grinding grain, Samson finally found his purpose. Look what it says. It says, but the hair on his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. In other words, it's symbolizing that in his weakest point, that he begins to reunite with God, and God's grace remains still accessible. And Samson's final act demonstrates that God can be most effective when we are at our most humble and dependent on him, that we allow God to work through him. And of course, we all know the story. He ends up defeating the very enemies that imprisoned him in his weakest point. Staying in our comfort zone prevents us from stepping into God's greater plan. Abraham is another story. I won't take the time to read it, but he's called out of his country to get into the unknown and chase after God's calling. And a spiritual awakening in his life leads to the birth of God's people. Moses, on the backside of the desert, 40 years of comfort, growing a family. God calls him to lead the people of Israel out of bondage and to deliver them into the promise. Gideon is a hiding mighty warrior in Judges chapter 6, and God calls him from a big army, 32,000 men, way down to just 300 men to defeat the enemies of God. And God calls men out of their comfort zone. He calls people out of their comfort zone so that we can fully depend on God to do what he can only do.